And the reason for that is that there's something called cross-coupling going on. And cross-coupling is basically where when you do one thing, it affects something else. So, for example, when you're driving a car, you have to be able to release the clutch pedal and press the gas at the same time, and that's coordination. If you're flying a helicopter, you have to be able to control the cyclic control and the pitch control at the same time as the pedals. And again, that requires immense coordination. Cross-coupling is the opposite. It's when you don't want something to happen and it does happen. So for example, if you were checking your mirrors, and every time you checked your mirrors you tug the steering wheel, that's cross-coupling. Yeah, it's something pilots are trained about, and it's something they're taught to avoid, because when you're flying an aircraft, sometimes you've got to operate the controls in such a way that you don't then operate another control which could affect the aircraft. It's very important to be able to isolate your hands and your feet in different dimensions. So for example, if you're turning the aircraft, you don't want to be pulling back on the controls and making the aircraft climb at the same time. So cross-coupling can affect you, and the way it affects bus drivers in reverse is, as they're concentrating on the braking, they just simply don't steer. Their hands get paralyzed and they steer very slowly. And you've got to be able to work the steering quickly. And what happens is when they start working the steering quickly, because they're pulling and pushing the wheel, it starts to affect their braking, and their braking becomes very lumpy, or the bus stops. And so this exercise teaches them to avoid cross-coupling. So it teaches them to drag the brakes in reverse and steer one way and then steer the other way. And it's really hard to do. It takes a lot of effort. But most people can get it after about maybe 20 minutes or half an hour. And once they've done that exercise, the reversing exercise itself becomes much easier, and it also improves their braking when they're driving forwards. So back to the actual reversing exercise itself. So we spoke about that little exercise we do to teach you about cross-coupling. Once you get onto the reversing, so the braking can suffer. The other thing that can happen is that you start to fishtail. So fishtailing is when you steer excessively in both directions. So you steer to the right first, and then rather than cancelling the steering and coming back towards the reversing bay, you keep steering and the bus becomes perpendicular. Now to cancel that, the only thing you can do is straighten up and steer the other way. But then when you steer the other way, you steer too much, and now the bus is too straight and you're going towards cone B, and then you have to steer the other way. And then when you steer the other way, you steer too much, and that action, those oscillations get worse. It's called fishtailing because the bus is just basically fishtailing its way down the reversing bay. It's because of excessive steering. You only really need to steer left once, then straighten the wheels, and then when you get near the box, you need to steer right once and straighten the wheels. If you're not cancelling the steering quickly enough, like I mentioned earlier, the bus will start to fishtail and you'll start to get really disorientated. And the reason you can get disorientated in a bus is because of the overhangs. Now, let's just talk about this. When you're sitting in your car, okay, if you're going forwards and you want the front of the car to go left, you turn left. If you want it to go right, you turn right. Same in the bus. If you want the bus to go right, you turn right. You want the bus to get left, you go left. In your car, when you're reversing, if you want the bus to go left in reverse, you look over your left shoulder and you steer the same way. If you want the car to go right in reverse, you look over the right shoulder and you steer the same way. But what happens is when you're in a bus is the logic is the same, the sense, as we call it, is the same. You still steer to the right to make the bus go back right in reverse. But what happens, because of the overhangs, the front of the bus starts to swing to the left. And that can give you the sensation that the actual bus is moving to the left, when of course it isn't. The bus is moving to the right in reverse. But because you're sitting at the front of the bus and you steer, and the front starts to swing over to the left, you almost think that you're steering the wrong way, because if you remember, if you go forwards and steer to the left, the front does this. But now because you're going back and steering to the right, the front is also doing this, and that confuses the hell out of people. They're sitting at the front of the bus and they're thinking, why when I'm steering to the right is the bus going to the left? It isn't. It's just the overhang swinging out. And that's something you need to be aware of. Don't let that confuse you. The other thing that can happen is as you're going back, you start to fixate on the cones on the right, And as you're coming back, if you steer too much to the right, the front near side mirror or the body can knock cone C over or move cone C. Because you're concentrating so much on the right hand side and you're not aware that the bus isn't straight, it's very easy to hit the mirror against the cone and actually knock the cone over. And that can happen on the right hand side too, but it mostly happens more on the left because people are concentrating so much on the right side because they're looking down the bus to see where the back is. The way we know when we've got to the back of the box is quite simply we use a marker along the side of the bus, either the exhaust pipe or something at the back of the bus that's protruding. And when we look down the side of it, that marker lines up with the yellow box painted on the ground. That's something you'll have to ask your instructor to show you. I can't really demonstrate that on this video because every bus is different, and some people put like a little bit of plasticine or a little bit of tape on the side of the bus just to show the trainees. It's like a gun sight. If you've ever fired a gun, you'll know that there are two sights on the gun and you have to make the sights line up to direct the bullet. Well, in the same way, you've got a sight on the side of the bus and you use that sight to tell you when you're in the yellow box. If you go past the yellow box, obviously it's a fail, because once you've gone past the yellow box, it's the equivalent of crashing into something behind you. At the DVSA test centres, they'll usually have a metal barrier, and if you've gone past the yellow box, then you might knock the barrier over, and of course that's a fail. In the same way, if you displace any of the cones, i.e. make the cones move by knocking them, that's also a fail. And if the front tyres or the rear tyres go over the yellow lines and they go outside the bay, that's also a fail. So remember, you can do two shunts. You are allowed to get out and have a look once you've reached the back, and as long as you make the vehicle safe, put the handbrake on, put it in neutral, put your high vis on, you can get out and have a look. If you're not in the box, you can bring it back a little bit further. And yes, remember to use your horn in reverse. Remember to keep using the left mirror as you go back. And just to recap, the mistakes that can happen is, number one, you keep stopping because you haven't got the brake control as you're steering. There's too much cross coupling. Number two, you steer excessively and the vehicle starts to fishtail. Number three, you knock the cone over with the mirror because you're not concentrating on it. You're so busy looking in the mirror, you're not actually aware that the mirror is going to knock the cone and the pole over. And number four, of course, just being too enthusiastic and coming back too quickly and going past the rear of the box.